Kirby Moore is officially off to Washington State. And the good news for Missouri is it has all the money in the world to find a new offensive coordinator.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And a little later in the program, I'm going to talk about the possible return to Mizzou Arena for Kim Anderson. But you know what? Before I start the program, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. And yes, if you know, if I'm doing a Saturday morning show during, what's ostensibly the offseason at this point. Yeah, no game here on Saturday. I know a bowl coming up here in a couple weeks, but obviously with Kirby Moore, the former now Missouri offensive coordinator, heading to Washington State to be that program's next head coach, well, I got to get in front of a microphone and tell you what I think. Well, first of all, I think, as I said, if you saw my short yesterday, I said that this is a win-win, I think, for both sides. Obviously, Kirby Moore getting to go back to, his old stomping grounds, more or less, an area that he knows very, very well, Pullman, Washington, an area I believe he grew up relatively close to, played his college football at Boise State as a wide receiver. So Kirby gets to go a little bit closer to home, and of course, being a head college football coach, that's an upgrade. I know the Pac-12 ain't what it used to be, but still, this is a great landing spot for Kirby Moore. And for Missouri, it's quite possible that for whatever reason, I think it's pretty obvious that the offense needs some new and fresh ideas. How much of that is Kirby Moore's fault? Frankly, I don't really care at this point. That's in the past. What's in the present and in the future is the idea that Missouri can absolutely pay top dollar for an offensive coordinator this offseason. So this is a massive decision that Eli Drinkwitz has in front of himself, but he has all the advantages in the world right now. I think Missouri is as well positioned as anybody in the country to get a really strong candidate here for the offensive coordinator position, because you take the $1.3 million that Kirby Moore was making, you add that on top of the $4 million, so you're looking at $5 million upwards potentially that Drinkwitz has to use here. That $4 million, of course, part of his contract extension, an extra $4 million for his assistants and football staffers. So while there are some people like perhaps Corey Batoon, the defensive coordinator, who might be looking at a contract extension, Batoon, obviously, in that Missouri defense, did great last season. Well, that still leaves a huge chunk of money to spend on an offensive coordinator. I mean, if you're going to spend $2.5–3 million, for example, on an offensive coordinator, that's putting you right up at the very top of the pecking order of college football. Remember when Blake Baker left Missouri as their defensive coordinator a couple years ago to go to LSU? Well, Missouri was willing to pay $2 million plus, I think, for Baker. He ends up leaving for LSU for about $2.5 million. So again, the point here is Missouri is in a great position to hire somebody really, really good. So the question is, what changes, if anything, under this new regime? Is Eli Drinkwitz going to look for somebody that is going to run a similar type of offense to what he has run his entire time at Missouri? Or do we look for somebody who will, for example, actually throw the ball over the middle of the field on occasion, except for the occasional crossing route and a slant? Or does Missouri, another question, was Missouri possibly promote from within? I'll be honest with you, I would rather not promote from within, because I'll be honest, that would be a really gutsy move on Eli Drinkwitz's part, because I think most of the fans would probably hate it. And that's nothing against Missouri's wide receiver coach, Jacob Peeler, for example, who could be a candidate there, or Curtis Luper, for example, the Missouri running backs coach, who on paper certainly deserves a excuse me, what's the word I'm looking for here? Curtis Luper certainly deserves a promotion. There we go. It came to me eventually, because he's been excellent as the Missouri running backs coach, from Cody Schrader to Tyler Beatty / Bidet to of course Ahmad Hardy. Now it seems like no matter who Missouri has back there, they have a productive rushing attack. But the thing is, obviously, it seems like the Missouri passing attack is the thing that could use a little bit more rethinking. So does that mean Curtis Luper is the guy for that job? I would say it's much more realistic that Missouri, especially for the price that you're looking at here, will go outside of the program. And quite honestly, most of the realistic names out there are no names to most fans out there, including me, by the way. I'm the first one to admit I'm not an expert on assistant coaches in college football. And that's okay, by the way. It's okay to admit that we aren't experts on offensive coordinators. And to be brutally honest, just throwing out Chase Daniel as a possibility for the millionth time is not adding a whole lot to the discussion. Now, there is one big name out there, Chip Kelly, that I think is actually a slight possibility if you're Missouri, because, well, Chip Kelly has been well-traveled since his days at Oregon and then UCLA as the head coach. Won a national title with Ryan Day as the Ohio State coordinator just a couple years ago. Well, things flamed out pretty quickly with the Las Vegas Raiders this past season, so Chip Kelly, once again, available. He would certainly be a change. He's not exactly just, hey, the outside zone heavy type of scheme. Chip Kelly is a very different type of offensive mind than what Eli Drinkwitz is usually accustomed to, I would say. So maybe that isn't the best fit in the world, but frankly, I think somebody different is exactly what Missouri needs. Whether that's Chip Kelly or somebody with a much lower profile to most fans, again, I think just hiring somebody to sort of run a different version of the Eli Drinkwitz offense maybe not be the right move. Listen, the rushing attack, keep that in place. I don't have any big problems with that. But the Missouri passing attack, obviously that's the part that needs a little bit of a rethinking. Now, as far as some other big names out there, well, how about Bobby Petrino? Obviously the guy can coach an offense. To me, not only does he have, well, baggage, let's put it that way, but he just strikes me as a guy who maybe is not going to play with others quite as nicely. I just don't know that he's going to be – I think he wants to be a head coach, quite simply. I don't know that Bobby Petrino wants to be an offensive coordinator long term, so I just don't love the fit there. Petrino strikes me as a guy who wants to be a head coach again somewhere. Another big name, hey, how about Gus Malzahn? He was the Florida State offensive coordinator this past season. Mixed results there. Looks good to start the season against Alabama. Obviously, the Florida State thing hasn't gone great. Eli Drinkwitz is basically one of Gus Malzahn's proteges for all intents and purposes. So there's obviously a real connection there. Would the Gus bus be willing to work under Drinkwitz? I think he would. I don't know exactly how realistic that is, but I thought that was an interesting name that others threw out there. And also Brian Harsin, too, former Auburn coach, another guy that Drinkwitz has worked with closely. Harsin was the offensive coordinator of Boise State during one of their big runs, their run to the Fiesta Bowl. He was the one who called the Statue of Liberty play and all that good stuff. Now, Harsin, not a guy who's well thought of in Auburn because of how that went as a head coach, but could he be a really good offensive coordinator? I think that's a possibility. But also, there's a very strong possibility, as people at Power Mizzou have pointed out, hey, we didn't even have Kirby Moore on our hot board the last time around. So it's very possible that Eli Drinkwitz and Missouri are looking for somebody the Missouri fans haven't even thought of. So once again, let's maybe put the Chase Daniel selection away for the winter. And when it comes to offensive coordinators in general, I'm going to be brutally honest with all of you. I think we all give offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators, for that matter, entirely too much blame. And to this point, I'm going to ask Missouri fans coming up a question that I don't think any of you can answer, and I think that's really going to make my point. So stick with me here. But first, hey, speaking of stick with me, if you need a gift at the last minute, well, stick with me. You need Omaha Steaks. I know lots of people out there are tough to give for. I've been accused of being that person as well. Well, trust me, nobody, including myself, is going to complain about the gift of food because, by the way, during their Sizzle All the Way sale, you can stop up and save in a huge way, 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. And it gets even better, by the way. Locked On College listeners get an extra $35 off with code COLLEGE at checkout. And we're not just talking fillets. We got burgers, comfort meals, sides, desserts. You can build a box for absolutely anyone. So save big on gourmet gifts and more holiday favorites with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide during their Sizzle All the Way sale. And for an extra $35 off, use promo code COLLEGE at checkout. Terms apply. See site for details. That's omahasteaks.com, code COLLEGE. And by Gametime. Yes, it is the Gametime app, the best place to get all of your last-minute ticket deals. Speaking of last-minute gifts, well, how about a last-minute ticket to an event? Who doesn't like going to Mizzou basketball games, of course? Maybe even the World Cup, if you're really getting out ahead of your skis. And really, if it sounds like it's impossible to get World Cup tickets, well, going to the World Cup gets more realistic instead of impossible with Gametime. Prices include fees up front, which I love, by the way. No last-second surprises at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying all your tickets to every match, concert, or event with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app, make an account, and use code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Gametime today. All right, Missouri fans, so this is going to be a very different question depending on how old you are, but stick with me here. Who is your favorite offensive coordinator in Mizzou football history? Now, again, obviously this can be a very different question depending on how old you are, but I strongly suspect that no matter if you're my father's age and you go all the way back to the 1960s as a Missouri fan, or maybe you're in your 20s and can barely even remember the Gary Pinkel era, I bet you're struggling to answer that question. Be honest. You don't have somebody at the tip of your tongue. Okay, I'll ask you a second question. Who's your favorite Missouri defensive coordinator ever? I bet you don't have one there either. And my point here is if you don't have a single name at the tip of your tongue here, my point is they can't all be bad. Can they? Especially when, if the Gary Pinkel era was as great as we think it was, a great 15-year run there, well, can all of his coordinators be stupid? That just doesn't seem possible. And to me, it just seems like we as fans, and I have certainly been as guilty of this as anyone over the course of my lifetime as a fan, we just look at the offensive coordinator and say, call better plays, even though we don't have any great suggestions on what plays that person should actually run. So my point here is that while, don't get me wrong, I think it was probably the right moment for Missouri and Kirby Moore to part ways and go with maybe a different philosophy here. But just to this idea that, well, Kirby Moore, who obviously I think did a great job in 2023, I think all Missouri fans would agree with that at the very least. Heck, the Missouri offense got a lot better from 22 to 23 when Drinkwitz handed the reins of play calling over to Moore. And my point is, obviously, the offense went down a little bit in 24. To me, that was much more due to the health of the quarterback and Brady Cook specifically than anything else. Did Kirby Moore just suddenly forget how to design an offense in 1 year? I just think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Again, not to say that he has zero blame. I'm definitely not going that far either. I just think we as fans go way too far on blaming everything on the coordinators at times. But you know what? Speaking of blaming everything on somebody, well, it would obviously be going too far to take the current state of Missouri basketball and blame it all on Kim Anderson. And here's my point here. I was actually looking at KenPom the other day. They not only have modern, specific rankings about this season, they also have a program rank for the history of their numbers, which goes all the way back to the late 90s, basically lines up perfectly with the post-Norm Stewart era at Missouri. And I gotta say, the program rank of 55th in the country hit me right between the eyes as a Missouri fan. And I started thinking, my God, are we as unrealistic as Nebraska football fans at this point? That one really stung, I have to say. But then I had to stop myself and say, you know what? That isn't a fair comparison because, well, basketball and football are so completely different. And obviously, Missouri has never been as successful as Nebraska football. But still, my overall point here is that, like with Nebraska football, well, the support is there for Missouri basketball, especially when you compare it to the rest of the Southeastern Conference. I would say Missouri basketball is as meaningful here than any program in the SEC outside of Kentucky. I really don't think that's an exaggeration. So to the idea that Missouri should be better, well, no, there's no actual guarantee here. We're not entitled to it, obviously, but I just keep thinking Missouri can obviously better with the amount of support that they have. But again, back to my original point there, I made a bit of a digression there, but you can't just blame Kim Anderson at this point for the state of Missouri basketball, or Quinn Snyder or Frank Haith or Konzo Martin for that matter. And to that point, obviously, the Kim Anderson era of Missouri basketball went about as badly as you could have possibly imagined. And yet, all of college basketball has had the opportunity to reset in the post-COVID, post-portal, post-NIL era. Hey, we're seeing Kansas try to struggle through some of that a little bit too. The point is, every program has had to adjust to this, and frankly, what happened in 2015, 16, and 17 might as well be 50 years ago at this point. It really doesn't matter that much anymore. So to that point, speaking of 50 years ago, well, on Sunday, tomorrow as I record here, the Tigers are welcoming back the 50th anniversary of the 75-76 team, the program's first Big 8 championship. By the way, they advanced to the NCAA tournament that year and made the Elite Eight, and in large part on the back of Kim Anderson, one of their great players that season, and truly one of the great pro players in Missouri history. So to me, I think it's time for healing here. I don't know if Kim's even going to come back tomorrow. My point is, I hope he does. I really hope he does. And Missouri's not making a big deal about it if he does, and that's probably the right way to go about it. Let's just slow play this whole thing a little bit. But truly, I think it's time for healing because Kim Anderson, obviously there was going to be an awkward period there after getting fired from Missouri and after things didn't go how any of us, including Kim, would have wanted. There's going to be a bit of an awkward period there. But I just don't think that's something that he or Missouri needs to take to the grave. He's a good man. He was a great player for Missouri. It's time to heal. That's how I feel about it. That's how I feel about Kim Anderson anyway. I'd love to hear how all of you think about it, that's for sure. And you know what? I'm going to cut it a little bit short here today on Locked On Mizzou because, well, quite honestly, it's a Saturday morning show. I appreciate you all getting with me here. So we're going to cut it off here, and thanks for joining me as always. And by the way, thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen, and thanks for making Locked On your #1 sports podcast network. And you already live your team every day. Now take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club today and get Locked On Mizzou with no interruptions, members-only Discord access, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. go to lockedonmizzou.supercast.com or check the link in the show notes to learn more. So until next time, I am John Miller, and thanks as always for listening to Locked On Mizzou.